Thursday, August the 22nd, 2023. And let us gather together and experience the goodness of God. I'm Pastor Trey. We will begin with our scripture of the week, Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 15, and a piece entitled by me, Forgiveness Creates a Future. Then I will be joined by Pastor Emily Larson to talk scripture and all the amazing ways that God has provided in our own experience of ministry. But first, a reading from Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. Then Joseph could no longer control himself for all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send away everyone from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in these lands 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it is not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and a lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and how all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. The adoption of this constitution lays the secure foundation for the people of South Africa to transcend the divisions and the strife of the past, which generated gross violations of human rights, the transgression of humanitarian principles in violent conflicts, and a legacy of hatred, fear, guilt, and revenge. These can now be addressed on the basis that there is a need for understanding, but not for vengeance. A need for reparation, but not for retaliation. A need for Ubuntu, but not for victimization. In order to advance such reconciliation and reconstruction, amnesty shall be granted in respect of acts, omissions, and offenses associated with political objectives and committed in the course of these conflicts of the past. With this Constitution and these commitments, we, the people of South Africa, open a new chapter in the history of our country, Constitution of 1993 for the Republic of South Africa. This comes from the interim Constitution for South Africa. It intentionally set up a bridge from the hyper-racist apartheid regime that drew boundaries based on skin color so harshly as to constitute a gross human rights abuse, and a modern, multicultural democracy. The specific passage that I just read enshrines into the founding fabric of the nation what would become the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Both victims of apartheid and perpetrators of apartheid still lived in the same nation. They hoped to avoid recurring cycles of bloodshed around past crimes without sweeping those crimes under the rug. They desired a nation based on the African concept of Ubuntu that roughly translates to "I live because you are," a deep interconnectedness between all people. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who ended up leading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, entitled his book on the process, no future without forgiveness, which also serves as a decent summary of the situation. People committed horrendous crimes. People suffered horrific injustices and violence. Now both of those groups sought to live as one nation. A process of truth, admitting what happened and letting the victims tell their story. A formal request for amnesty, and then reconciliation and forgiveness without forgetting seemed to be the only way to let that happen. Now, nearly 30 years on, it worked out, at least in the broad strokes. Forgiveness can give life to both forgiver and forgiven, allowing everyone to live in a new way. We see this process play out in Jacob's family here in Genesis chapter 45. Joseph's brothers committed a crime against him so famous that it has its own Broadway musical. Jealous of his relationship with their father, the other sons of Jacob knock out Joseph, sell him to slavers, and tell their father that he died. For a while, things for Joseph only degrade. He ends up in prison and faces death many times, but eventually he works his way up to a highly respected position in Egypt. Things only go marginally better for his brothers. They remain in their father's house, but a famine forces them to seek help in foreign lands. Joseph's respected position and his brothers' near starvation bring them back into contact. And then the question on the table becomes one of survival. Without Joseph's help, the rest of God's people, at that point solely made up of Jacob's family, will die out. Without forgiveness, they too have no future. As it says in Genesis chapter 45, God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Genesis 45, verses 7 and 8. Joseph does forgive, and in doing so, gives them a future. Here we glimpse Joseph's spiritual superpower, processing the trauma, staying connected to God, and not letting past harms hold him back. He's no longer a slave. Now he has risen to the administrator of all Egypt. Even though he suffered, he can see how God has used that suffering and how he can help God's people even if they don't deserve it. If you survey the Old Testament, Joseph stands out as one of the few unblemished characters. He never wavers in his faith or has complicated romantic relationships or sells out God's people for earthly power. His only sin seems to be being a mildly braggy teenager. His forgiving his family stands in that line of faithful accomplishments. He had every right to turn them away. They harmed him, and they weren't Egyptian, and thus had no claim on the grain. He decided to not let those things stand in the way, and his family survives. For their part, the brothers never assumed that they deserved forgiveness. When Joseph reveals himself, they blanch, expecting the other shoe to drop. As it says in Genesis chapter 45, verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. This silence speaks volumes. To me, it reads as a recognition of the harm, and that they cannot expect any good going forward. Their minds race with the recognition that because of what they did, they doomed God's people. No doubt they lived a lifetime in that silence as all hope drained away. That moment is its own kind of wordless confession. Thanks be to God, and God working in Joseph, their nightmare scenario of causing the death of God's people doesn't play out. They get forgiven. Their world continues turning. This isn't just about nation states or biblical families. Anytime we forgive, we tear down a wall. We lessen the number of grudges poisoning our world. We open another opportunity for us and those around us to live fuller lives. The brokenness of modernity thrives on hate, but in forgiving, we take away some of that hate's potency. We forge new ways for God's people to thrive. However, we won't always be in the forgiver column. We will also need forgiveness and won't deserve it. In those times, we need to recognize forgiveness as an undeserved gift, confess the wrong, and then hope. Maybe the person on the other side will offer us a future. Fantastic. Let me make sure that all my settings are right. Yes. Check, 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 check. Testing 1, 2, 3. That is skosh. Hey, you ready to do a show? Me too. As you just heard in the piece, one of the directions I took with this is is this like liberating view of forgiveness, right? That forgiveness, feels, at least for me, can feel really unnatural and frankly unjust, right? To offer forgiveness isn't a way to let go of a kind of material justice. And yet it can be what lets the world live. And right, we see like it plays out in really beautiful fashion here with Joseph, right? Joseph's forgiving his family literally saves God's family from God. At this point, the whole of God's people is one family. It saves that one family, literally saves God's people from dying. And then the other version, like not version, but kind of expanding it in the sermon, is looking at this idea of divine provision from this incredibly unexpected place. And all of it hinges on Joseph's forgiveness, right? You have shown up in a faraway land, right? And who do you come across but the brother that you sold into slavery has now risen to the Lord of all Egypt. And so I really think that key moment in this whole scripture is the two beats. I am Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive? Oh.
I love that you pointed that out, and it made me do a deeper dive of the scripture here.
Yeah.
Because I had never thought of that record scratch moment that the brothers must have had in their head of, oh heck, this is, time for our eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Fortunately, Joseph didn't want everyone going around toothless and blind and chose forgiveness. But, the deep dive that I did of scripture here, when it says that his brothers couldn't respond because they were terrified, because they were dismayed. Did you know that is the same phrase that the Israelites use when they first are facing the Philistines and Goliath comes out?
I didn't know that. Oh my gosh.
So before, David shows up, when Saul and the Israelites are facing the Philistine army and out comes Goliath and gives this big challenge, that is the same phrase of, and they couldn't respond because they were so terrified. Same reaction from Joseph's brothers, because this is literally, okay, now we've doomed our entire families.
Right. They're
all of the generations, they're all, out of luck now because they're dependent upon this charity from Egypt. And now it all comes down to Joseph.
Well, and I brought this up in the sermon, right? So part of what makes Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the land of Canaan, a land of Israel, whatever word you want to use it for right now. I guess right now it's the land of Canaan, in this, where we are in the story. But it's the crossroads between the two major empires, right? Whether that Egypt is this kind of perennial power, and then whoever's running, Iraq, Iran today, Mesopotamia today. Is it Sumer? Is it Assyria? Is it Babylon? Do we even need to differentiate between all of those, right? And so they could have gone one, if you are in the land of Canaan, you can go one of two, because you're on this major trade route and you're constantly getting conquered by one of these people because, they go a fighting, and eventually the Greeks show up from the Aegean and the Romans come. But at this point in history, that's literally thousands of years into the future, right? This is probably 2000 BC, like 4,000 years ago. And so Julius Caesar is not even a glimmer, right? Like, the Trojan War hasn't even happened yet. Homer ain't writing. This way predated. This is old. You're on this major trade route between the two of them. And so you pick one. Am I going to go to Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon? Or am I going to go to Egypt? And they chose Egypt, right? It's a coin flip. They picked Egypt, right? And then because the nature of travel in that time, the sunk cost, right? Like, if this doesn't work out, this doesn't work out.
And then they're sunk, not just for them, but their families. They're like, this will put them into poverty. This famine is the end of their line, right?
Jacob can't be spring chicken, right? We keep going. Is my father still alive? Is a thing Joseph says like 4 times, right? Like,
right.
It's doomed. They're doomed, right? Like, they have in that moment, it is all of the worst case scenarios play out.
Mm-hmm.
And that, we've come all this way. We can't survive a journey. We're going to have a hard time making it back. We can't then go to Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, right? Like, we're not that's a journey of months.
Right. And that's if this brother chooses to just let them go.
Right.
Even, right?
Because he could
Joseph
just
didn't even have to do that.
Right.
He could just have him killed.
He just
or thrown in prison.
He didn't even have to do it himself, right? He's the Lord of all Egypt, And
he would have been justified in doing that because of what they had done to him, right?
Right, yeah. So there's they have no right to the grain. They have no right to his forgiveness. And this is the ancient world, and he's a powerful government official. This can go any kind of way Joseph wants it to go, right? In role-playing terms, right? Sometimes a GM, a game master, can go commit an action as hard as they like, right? If someone fails a roll badly enough, a GM can counter the player as hard as they like, right? They have rolled a 1, right?
Yep.
Whatever system you're rolling in, right? Like they have rolled straight 1s. And where they have picked, in that moment, the wrong place, where now, at absolute random, what could be potentially the worst person. And there they are. Dead. They are dead.
Dead.
Just dead. And then they're not. Right?
Because Joseph chose. Because Joseph chose forgiveness.
He chose forgiveness. And in choosing forgiveness also becomes an aspect of divine providence, right?
Right.
Of an aspect of God providing, right? That this is about as random, right? We see as random, right? Obviously, this is watching God play chess, right?
Right.
What we see as random is God working 3 moves ahead or 1,000 moves ahead, right?
Right.
That they committed a horrific crime against Joseph. That, in part because of God and in part because of Joseph, right? Joseph is, I bring this up a little bit, but Joseph is this prototypical hero. In a book that doesn't actually have as many heroes as you think, right? True heroes, right? Like truly good people. This is one of those like Jesus' dad is named Joseph too, because he is also a hero.
Just the good guy. Yes, you don't see the moral failings that you see in the other heroes that we say, in David or whoever.
Right, and those guys are heroes too, but they're complicated. Joseph, after being kind of a braggy teenager, is uncomplicated. He just does, and so part of what happens is Joseph gets the literal whatever kicked out of him, and he never takes his eye off the prize. Right. He, consistently stays faithful to God. Right. You have this scene earlier, where Potiphar's wife, the guy who bought Joseph, Joseph is his slave, but he's Joseph, and so he's risen, even as a slave, has risen to a high position in Potiphar's house, because of course he has. So much so that like Potiphar just looks at Joseph like, "Hey, you want to take care of all that?" And Joseph's like, "Yeah, Doc, I got this." And so he's just like, he's this high position in Potiphar's house. He's running the household. And Potiphar's wife, for whatever reason, maybe Joseph's a real good looking guy, I don't know, wants to sexually entrap him. And Joseph, being Joseph, is like, no. And so she like works harder and harder to entrap him. It's how he ends up in prison because, you know, she tries to trap him. He runs away. In running away, however this works, he loses all of his clothes.
Leaves as a garment? Yeah.
So garment is somewhat of a misnomer. He's naked.
Yeah.
There are no, like, you don't, like, there are not other clothes.
Right.
He's naked.
Yeah.
And she's like, he's naked and I have his clothes.
Yep. But
right.
even in that test,
right.
we see Joseph standing firm and following God and doing what is right. And it just shows in that character of Joseph through all of this, through this final interaction with him and his brothers and the next where he, you know, is reunited with his father and gives them this place of safety for him and his brothers and his, you know, all of their children and grandchildren and livestock, and they all get to come to Egypt and live out this idea of Ubuntu, right?
Right.
That idea of Ubuntu that you referenced.
Right. That he really like opens that up for them, that he, right, you know, I am Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive? Right? Like,
yes.
He, in reintroducing himself, immediately essentially says, so in a Hebrew version, like, it is very, like, we are a clan, right? Like,
yes.
we are the 12 tribes, we
are
the
clan. Tribe, we are an us. We are the we.
Us. This is, like, you know, in African culture, we would talk about, in certain African cultures, we talk about Ubuntu. Here we are, I guess that's the Swahili word, but, like, we have this concept of Ubuntu.
I am because we are.
I am because we are. The
right.
collective connectedness of humanity. And in Hebrew culture, it is, we are this family. We are God's people. We are this. And that's what he leads with, right? I am Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive? And even then, they're like, how is this going to go? Mm-hmm. And, like, so you see that, like, certainly part of this story is just an important hero story certainly for a people who keep finding themselves in exile. And I'll come back to that in a second. But also you see God playing 3D chess of, okay, my people are going to need providing for. And my people are about to be absolute idiots. Okay. I see your move. I have a counter for it.
Mm-hmm.
I am not going to let you destroy this family. You're going to try really hard. You're fixing to try real hard to destroy this family. I am not going to let you destroy this family because I can put Joseph. I know that Joseph is going to do these things. I know the character. It's God, right? I know the character of Joseph. I know that he will stay with me and I will stay with him. And so when the time comes, someone in this equation will do the right thing. And this is the, like, what feels like the unexpectedness of God is actually, to me, God playing 3D chess.
It's that good provision of God.
Yeah. So that's the, like, and I think we've talked about this before, but so there's the line, we did Romans 8 not that long, as a scripture not that long ago. And there's that line in Romans 8 that is like, all things work together for your good. And it's easy to get really hung up on that because, like, no, some things are bad. Getting sold into slavery is bad. But God can take that bad thing and use it. So you're sold into slavery. Okay. Well, you might end up the prime minister of Egypt if you can stay faithful. And end up, you know, providing Ubuntu, providing literally salvation for God's family, for the whole people of God.
And it's because of that faithfulness of Joseph. It's because Joseph stayed true to the character that God wished for him to have. Because if Joseph had chosen to stray, if Joseph had chosen not to forgive, there's that phrase about forgiveness that withholding forgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yeah.
Right? Would have done Joseph no good. And not that it was without grief, right? I mean, there was a lot of grief and wailing. There was a lot of falling on necks and embracing one another at the end. There was a lot of crying from Joseph so that other people in the household heard it.
Yeah.
It was not without hurt on Joseph's part.
Well, there's huge emotion. You sense that huge emotion from him.
Mm-hmm. But to be able to move with that emotion, past that emotion, to be able to use that emotion to make the forgiveness that much more meaningful, to make it that much more worthwhile a thing of having, to restore that community, to restore that relationship, to be that tribe, that family again.
And so this is where I often pause and remember not when this story comes from, because this story was a campfire story long before it was written, like for 1,000 years before it was written down, right? This is... this story predates written Hebrew, for instance, right? Like this is, this story is at the dawn of written language, right? So it's a campfire story. It most likely gets written down into the form that we call Genesis during the exile. And this is where Joseph, Esther, and Daniel become really important heroes. Because the thing that Joseph, Esther, and Daniel have in common is how do you navigate being in exile? How do you navigate being a prominent voice in not your country? How do you stay faithful in these kind of situations? And those three heroes, those three biblical figures, Joseph, Esther, and Daniel, take on that role, right? So you have, what do you do if Nebuchadnezzar throws you the lions? You're going to be fine. What happens when your cool friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Not enough kids named Abednego. We need more. There was a time where you could be named Shadrach. We should bring them back. There are not enough Abednegos and Meshachs around. I
guess so, yeah.
It's not enough. I have a Thomas and Esther, and I am done. But I swear to God, I would name a kid Shadrach. That's just a good name, right? Okay, all that aside, what do you do when you get thrown in the fiery furnace? What happens when you are so faithful? Right? That's all those stories, right?
Right. You are so faithful that you are persecuted. You are thrown into a furnace. You are thrown into a lion's den. You are, whatever the case may be. What do you do?
What do you do if Haman is going to kill your people and you win a beauty contest, right?
Right.
What do you do when you find yourself in prison and you get a dream oracle, right?
Right.
What's particularly interesting about the Joseph story, if you think about the context of exile, right? So you have the people that get exiled, and then you have the people that are still back at home. Not everyone goes, right? And so there's this edge to the Joseph story getting written down in current form during the exile. You can hear the author going, we have a story for this, right? Let us make sure, because this is if you read, this is 10%, this story is 10% of Genesis.
Right.
Right? It is chapter after chapter of, because we just read this one 15-verse snippet, but it is several chapters of dramatic irony, and we're not even bringing up the whole bit where he hides jewelry, they go and they get
and they come back and then they
back and then he
leave Benjamin and all the things.
Go back and get Benjamin and then leave Benjamin. It's this Genesis 49, 50 chapters. This is seriously 10% of Genesis. We created the whole world in a chapter. And this is 5, okay?
Yep.
Right? I was doing a Bible study on the Noah story earlier today. And it's like 3 chapters. We kill off the majority of humanity and repopulate the earth in 3 chapters. This is like 5 chapters.
And it's one family, one tribe. But this is how you keep a people of God together, is with an origin story.
But like
right?
zooming in at such the micro level of we're going to forgive each other like Joseph did. Just as that's how God provided us for us then, is how we're going to do it now. We're not coming apart now, right? Because you can imagine, like, there are some people at home, there are some people in exile. The people who got sent into exile and the people responsible for the sending into exile are now in exile together. And you can imagine that is awkward. Hi, this is your fault that we're here, right? And so, like this story is really, like, important about thinking about, like, a future of forgiveness and the, like, incredible ways that God constructs reality to provide for God's people. But, like, and we are an audience. We are always an audience for this. And we're not, but, like, I love thinking about the original audience for the written version of the story. You can just, like, we're gonna slow this way down.
And you're really gonna pay attention, because I really need you to hear that. Are you paying attention? Forgiveness, people. Forgiveness.
So that we don't all die.
Yeah.
Forgiveness and faithfulness in exile. Joseph, Esther, Daniel.
Right.
And forgiveness so we don't all die. We could. So it is stay together as a people, right? That's why we write this down. Write any of this down now is to now, 1,400 years ago, write down in exile, right? Is this like tool for holding the people together, right? When you are no longer around those campfires of your ancestors, that's the time when you write it down, because it now becomes important to not lose it, right?
Yes.
When you were just the people living in the land together, you were never going to lose your stories. You write them down when they're at risk of being lost, right? Like this is a way lesser version of this, but like the Grimm's fairy tales get written down as Germany modernizes.
Right.
Right? So like we're just living in a more modern world, and we're no longer sitting around and telling these stories in the same ways. We have a mass media, we have, the printing press, we have, and so they take the time, the Grimm's brothers take the time to write the stories down so they aren't lost. I read Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. This was her interviewing the last living slave. Or the last living person imported from Africa as a slave. Because there's this, like, weird, highly illegal, it was always horrific, and this was also horrific and illegal, slave ship that went in, like, the mid-1800s, shortly before the Civil War, and brought back a load of slaves. Now, importation of slaves has been banned for 50 years. I'm going to make numbers up. I think it was 1808. Don't quote me on that. I'm not going to Google it. Fact-checking ruins podcasts. But like early 1800s, importation of slaves is banned. But this guy does an illegal thing, and Cujo was the last living guy from that ship. And so he was the last living person who knew both Africa and living in Africa as a free person, being enslaved, and making the Middle Passage to the United States. And she interviews him in like the 1920s. So that story would not be lost, right? She does, she's novelist, but she's also ethnographer. And so she does this and she like keeps bringing him like peaches, or eating peaches with him. And then like some days he wants to talk to her and some days he doesn't. And then like, it's a really great book. It was actually like kind of a lost work that then only recently got published. Anyways, all of this is to say, in those, like, when the stories are at risk of being lost is when you write them down. And so that's, the first 5 books of the Old Testament that we know, the Pentateuch, the Torah, that is where they come from. Particularly the, like, story, Genesis and Exodus as written books. Again,
Right.
that's not where these stories come from. These stories are, story of Noah is hard to date. The story of Abraham is not hard to date. It's 4,000 years ago. And this is only, a couple generations, 3 generations on from Abraham. So we're talking, 3,900 years ago. So that's where these stories date to. But they get written down at a time. Focus, look at me. We're not going to die.
Pay attention, people.
Pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's also helpful that, like, they needed to hear it, and so do we, right? We need to hear that God provides, not necessarily from, like, a sky beam, like a Marvel movie where, like, a sky beam comes down and then stuff happens, right? But sometimes because of the seemingly random or the least likely people that God have placed in my life. And so there's, like, this strong edge to me that we need to hear, like, of, don't judge a book by its cover. Don't, but also... it turns out forgiveness is liberating for everybody. Forgiveness is the only way we're going to live. That seems as good a place as anywhere to take a break. We're going to be back with our segment, How to Restart a Church, and more stories about God providing, about what seems random to us and is actually God's 3D chess of making church happen. We'll be right back. And we're back with a segment that we call How to Restart a Church. And actually, this seemed like a really good scripture a really good night to talk about that, like, in the end, how you restart a church, how churches grow, how churches survive is by the random acts of God's providence. That, like, it turns out that your brother has become the Lord of all Egypt and he's forgiven you. So random. In the sermon, I talked about, all the time, like, I always need worship leaders. Worship leaders are in contemporary churches, an incredibly valuable skill set. And I'm often in, like, towns of 1,100 people. And, like, how do you find a worship leader? You don't. God just sends you one. Right?
Yep.
Like that, we had launched this contemporary service that was definitely what that church needed, right? Like, it was a town of 1,100 people, but that church was growing. But the average age of the citizen of Lexington, Texas at the time was like 34. It was a weirdly young town. It's why the United Methodist Church kept sending young clergy there. But we needed a contemporary service. And I'm like, it's a town of 1,100 people. Where do I find a worship leader? I didn't have an answer for that question. And my leadership started hounding me. It was like, Trey, we need to launch this service. And I really wanted a contemporary service, but I was the holdout. I was like, I don't have a worship leader, y'all. I have no idea how to find one. And someone said, just launch it. It'll be fine. And I'm like, okay, whatever.
Sometimes you just gotta launch it. Sometimes you just gotta do it.
You just gotta
jump.
So we jumped, right? And we were singing along to background tracks, which I don't love, but I had at least, like, someone up front willing to lead it. And like, it was, the first Sunday, we had like 40 people in there, which was amazing. And like the second Sunday we do it, there's this new couple, new family, a husband, a wife, and two daughters. And like, the husband of this new family who'd only come, like, they came to the traditional service 1 week, they came to the contemporary service the second week. This is like the second week we've ever done it. And he comes up to me and he's like, hi, my name's Brian. Yeah, no, I remember you from last week. It's good to see you again. Came to a different service. He's like, yeah, I used to be a guitarist or a worship leader for a satellite location of a mega church in Dallas. And I'm like, oh, really? And it's like, and unprompted, right? Like, this is where, like, as a pastor, you have to no-sell that. You cannot leap too quickly to, can you now run my entire life? You're going to scare away the children. And so I have to, like, no-sell it a little bit. Oh, really? And then he's like, would you like me to help? And I'm like, essentially, and I'm not a toucher. I wanted to hug him. Like, I am not often spontaneously driven to desire physical contact with other humans. I wanted to hug that man. And I had to, like...
Sometimes God just sent the exact person that you needed. You had a this-shaped hole, and then a this-shaped person showed up.
Just showed up. And, like, by the time I left, the service had become like a fixture of the congregation. And I was only there 2 years, right? So in a year, in large part thanks to Brian, it was this wonderful service. When the lady who followed me there, Reagan, who's my friend, who we're going to have on the show at some point, because she's doing a church restart thing too. By the time she left, that service was like 100. That service equaled the traditional service, and it was just amazing. And they got it to a place where they could, like, when Brian moved, because he was there because he was he became an elementary, assistant principal, and when he moved on, left the area, they could actually hire someone but like it took that, like, I didn't have money to pay somebody. Right. We didn't know if that service was going to work. And then here is, as a volunteer, the exact human we needed.
But what would have happened if you hadn't just launched? Right? Sometimes you just have to leap. Sometimes you just have to launch try something.
If I hadn't launched, Brian wouldn't have heard in the announcements his first Sunday that we have a contemporary service. Right. And so Brian may not even known that we were thinking about that, right? Because we don't, like, stream of consciousness everything we're thinking as a leadership just out in announcements, right? I spent a lot of time
much less have shown up that second Sunday. Right. Much less have volunteered, right? All those steps would not have happened if you had not just launched it. Sometimes you just got to ship it, right?
Yeah, you just got to ship it.
Whether you're ready or not.
Right, and so we just put it out there in the world, and then the exact right person showed up. It's like the other story I told in the sermon where, Grace Church, people a second chance. Dude came to our church. I'm going to not use names just for reasons. Everyone's wonderful people in this. It's just, some complicating factors. But dude shows up because of some legal stuff, ends up, a part of our church community with no expectations other than, like, he is just allowed to participate. And he turns out that in his 30s, he had taught himself to be essentially a professional level pianist, and had a decent singing voice. And we had a worship leader quit, shockingly unexpectedly.
Very, very unexpectedly.
I think it was like.
Right before Easter.
Right, it was like the Sunday before Easter.
Right before Easter.
Yeah, it was right before Easter.
Kind of a big deal in the church.
It was, and he didn't tell me. He only told the band. Like, it was real, like, but, like, this dude who had randomly showed up had gotten recruited in the band, and then, but we didn't ask him. Like, he was never, like, he just got, like, I didn't ask him. Like, no, like, I didn't even know he was a pianist. And then he ended up worship leader and, like, ran the band. And he just, like, showed up, didn't know he was a musician, didn't know anything other than, like, hey, is it cool if he chills here? And we're like, yeah, no, it's definitely cool that he chills here.
Yes. And then, was incredible. Right?
And was incredible.
Was incredible. Yeah. Was exactly what was needed at that time in that place in that space that we couldn't have recruited for. Like, we couldn't have put that application out there. We couldn't have hired that job description in time. We couldn't have workshopped that. There's so many times that we think we have to have all of the details figured out before we can start something. You have to know all of the ways that every social media platform works before you just start doing something. Yeah. But really, you kind of just have to do it. You kind of just have to ship it. You kind of
just have to set out for Egypt and hope there's food there, right?
Right. Like, you just got to create the content. You just got to start the service. You just got to, try the thing that you don't know if it's going to work or not, but you try it anyway.
I mean, I guess that is an aspect of that scripture we did not highlight in the previous segment, right? Like, they just set out, right? They don't know. They don't know.
Anything can happen.
There's not, like, a website where you went and, like, pre-registered for food, right? They just, like, left home. It was like, well,
hoping
it's bad.
There was food at the end of the journey.
Right. Yep. And there was. Yeah, there is this, like, you need a plan. I always say this. Let's be clear. I'm the long-range planner of the team. This will become clear about my own proclivities, but, like, I'm the long-range planner. And so you need a plan. But also,
Be ready for God to show up and do something different and unexpected within the bounds of that plan, or to redirect that plan, or whatever the case may be. There's so often in our ministry together that I swear I'm going to needlepoint this someday on a pillow. That why don't we just try that?
Just try that, yeah.
Why don't we just try that? If it might work, it might not, but we can try and see what happens and see where God shows up and see, if this is a season for this. If it's not, if it's something we tried and failed at, that's okay too. But being willing to get out there and try something and fail something and just be willing to go on that journey and hope that there's food at the end of it, or launch that contemporary service and hope that a worship leader shows up
or something. I mean, I honestly,
whatever
it's just
the case
like,
may be.
I don't know. I've thought about that a lot. Like, what did I think was going to happen? And I think I don't have an answer. It was just one of the, like, a whole bunch of people told me essentially to, ship it. Let's just do it.
Let's just do it.
We got energy. Like, we know this is what we need. Let's just do it, right? Like, don't sit here. And I was like, okay, he wouldn't mind me saying this out loud. A student named Chuck Moore. He was my trustee's chair. He is a boomer, but like he was really into contemporary worship. He had a decent singing voice, and he's like, let's just, he's a real go-getting guy. He had led the project to build the Family Life Center for that church. I run into him at annual conference every year, and big hug, and it's always Chuck's a great guy, and so Chuck is leading this charge. But like Stephanie, who was my program director, she's really pushing it, and this other lady, and they're like, let's just do this, and I'm like, okay, here we go, and then it turned out exactly. When I got here, to this church, we have a Spanish service that is our largest service. And we have an English service that is smaller that I preach at, and Pastor Yanni preaches at the bigger service. And technically, we have an integrated leadership, right? We are not a church, I'll say this as loudly as humanly possible whenever anyone wants to tell me, we are not one of those churches that, we don't host a Spanish congregation. We are one church, somos una iglesia, right? We are one church. And this was my big grand speech in Spanish that I gave to our Spanish folks on day one is hi, I am also your pastor. Hola, soy un otro pastor por usted. Right? I am also your pastor. Yenny's great. I'm not replacing Yenny. Yenny's tremendous. But we're one church. But nothing in our church could happen bilingually because my Spanish is okay. I can talk. I can't translate.
Mine is terrible.
And Yenny's English, she's working on it, but ain't her first language, right? She's Cuban by way of Honduras. She's only been in this country a few years, right? Her English, she's not able to translate either. Neither of us have that skill set. And so it's really hard for us to really work as one church, right? We had on paper, we had Spanish-speaking members on our board. Well, they couldn't really participate in board meetings because no one could translate them. Now, bless them, they gamely showed up anyways. God love them, right? They came, they did their best, but we couldn't really work together. It was clear that a lot of us were real simpatico, but we couldn't talk. And then at the beginning of the year, at random, Hispanic Ministries academic from the East Coast, New York, Puerto Rican, more than fluent in both languages, speaks Spanish better than I do, which isn't hard, speaks English better than I do, which also isn't hard, right? But PhD level intelligence in Hispanic ministries and integrating ministries and creative ministries, consulted with this guy named Dr. David Traverso, consulted with every denomination under the sun. Just showed up and has been here ever since. And now he's on staff as our Hispanic Ministries consultant and on-staff translator. At that time, we could not afford a translator. He just showed up. And it was yeah. At some point, I want to get put on staff because I really want to dig in. And I'm like, that makes sense, David. Hey, can you translate this board meeting? Yeah, no problem.
And I think that speaks also to this idea of, yes, God is going to provide, but also you need to open your eyes and see who's around you and see what's around you. And that the importance of recognizing what is around you and who's invited to the table and why that's important. Because there's so many gifts and talents and graces out there that God is ready to use if we are willing to open our eyes and see them.
Well, it ends up being this, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure how quote unquote theologically correct this statement I'm going to make is, but it is actually how I think. That one of the so as a senior pastor, you're looking for the data points from God, right? We call it discernment, but discernment isn't always go up onto the mountaintop and stare at the sky or something. I don't know. It's not what I do. A lot of it is looking at the data points available to you. Mm-hmm. And one of those key data points I use as a senior pastor is who's showing up. Who are the unexpected people here? And what does that tell us? You see a puppet if you're watching the video version, you see an amazing puppet in the back.
I'm waiting for the comments about what is the puppet in the back.
Yeah, so I'll tell you about what the puppet in the back is. So I show up here on day 1, and our worship director, Charles Yeager, for the English service, is also a professional puppet maker. And you go, well, that's random. And anytime you go, well, that's random, you start that to me is a data point of why is everything role playing, right? I don't know. Clearly,
you've been playing some D&D lately.
I've got D&D on the brain, but in a lot of role-playing systems, you can roll to lift the veil, right? You can roll to take in information, right? And the senior pastor version of that is you are looking at who's already here, who just showed up, and what does that tell us about what God is trying to do here? Right? Just before, this is true. The year before COVID, I had to rebuild the whole tech team for Grace Church, the people of the second chance. It was this was already the second chance on a tech team. I had to do a second chance on a tech team. And brand new volunteer who had been going to a previous church, wanted to come to us, came, a guy named Ken Diesterhoff. Well, Ken took over the whole streaming side of our ministry and pushed me to upgrade it just in time for COVID to hit and to become for it to become our whole business.
Mm-hmm. Or the fact that we taught right before COVID. I mean, this was February 2020.
So
we taught that seminar about live streaming and the importance of live streaming.
Yeah. So I think we were that for some. Hit. I think we got to be. I don't often get to say this with confidence because it's whatever. I think we were divine providence. We were the random people. For a whole bunch,
of small rural churches that need to figure out how to live stream real fast during COVID.
Yeah, because seriously, 3 weeks before the lockdown.
Yep.
We did a presentation on digital ministry.
And then the calls that we got of I should have come to your class instead of the other one. Help! And we went, okay, we're here.
Yeah, okay, no, okay, we got you.
We're on the way. We got you.
we got to be and that ministry also happened because. Randomly in Tyler is Mustard Seed Ministries that refurbishes computers and sells them at very reasonable prices. And so I had this while we had all these electronics shortages, I had this unlimited pipeline of computers that I could just go to Tyler and she was very COVID safe. It was largely an older congregation. It's a bunch of 70 and 80-year-old people refurbing these computers. And so they were very COVID safe. And so we had health department level transfer protocols of how I went and picked up, it was okay, I'm going to set them down and then I'm going to close the door and then you're going to open the door. And then it was fine, whatever. I just need these computers. I'm happy to keep you all safe, but we needed computers. And so that ministry could only work because when there were shortages on all these parts, I had this other source, right? It was all of these pieces of God playing 3D chess. But we did this.
We say random, but really, this is God playing 3D chess, just like Joseph. I mean, this is all the pieces falling into place for such a time as this, right?
And so it told, when coming into the new year was, I think, hard for both Yenny and I. I've been there 6 months, and just, this church restarting business is hard. Yenny, there's been some upheaval in the Spanish service that these things happen. And so I think we were both at a real frustration point. And then all of a sudden, here's David, right? And I was like, well, that's an interesting, my data brain, my long range planner, my looking for the will of God. It's like, well, that's interesting.
Isn't that nice that coincidence happened
That's
in a world where we don't really believe in coincidences?
Right,
We just believe in divine providence.
Right.
Or the coincidence of we needed a van and
Right.
just the right van showed. We purchased a van today. It's a very exciting day.
But I don't say this, in your hearing often, because I don't want it to go to your head, right? But this is also in some ways the origin story of me and you working together, right? Mm-hmm. I show up in Palestine, Texas, a town of 20,000 people where I don't know anybody. I really need someone to help me rebuild this thing, and I can't do it. It's really clear I'm not capable of doing it by myself. And you had shown up the year previous and were already my youth director.
Yep.
Right? That was also a data point, right? In the same way that we also had this amazing team member who had joined the church only a year before you, Sister Brandy Dudley. And Brandy was there, right?
Yes.
It is that, coming to grace and surveying the wreckage, you are doing the assessment of, who's here that shouldn't be? And why is, a Duke-trained career youth director here? What are, the very nice version of, what are you doing here? Also, married to a guy who I definitely went to punk shows with in the early 2000s.
Right.
As he was from the way south, I was from way north, but I-45 connects everything. And so, Tim and I can actually pinpoint that we were at, the same, we never met, at least officially,
but
not that
in
we
the
remember.
same places at the same time.
At the same time, right?
And then all in this tiny East Texas town. What
And
are we
then
all doing there?
Another dude from that same scene eventually joined the church. And we're just why are 3 Houston suburb kids, punky Houston suburb kids in there? At that point, we're in our early to mid 30s. Why are we all here? Right. But that is that is another one of those, looking at the data points, who here, what here feels random? What here seems out of place? Why is a hyper spiritual black church trained African American lady at my punky but devastated contemporary church? I don't know, but we're going to run with this. And she ended up running our whole outreach, and then she ended up coming onto the ministry team. And now she is herself, she's on staff at Grace now as her full-time job. And she has 2 churches that she tends to of her own. It's an amazing, what can God do when God, essentially when you let God play 3D chess in your life and your church.
Yes.
Right. I realized we could do these all night because it's
right. We've got a lot of stories.
We've got a lot of stories because that's that's how it happens.
That's the nature of God. God shows up when you are willing to be used by God, when you are willing to stay faithful to God, when you're willing to just do a thing, even if it doesn't make sense, even if you don't know what all the details are. God does, right? God knows.
Yeah. God knows.
You just got to show up. You just got to be there. You just got to do it.
That is as good a place as anywhere to bring this thing in for a landing. Thank you so much for joining us again on The Goodness of God. I really enjoy doing the show, and I hope y'all enjoy it too. If you have feedback or want to add your own story of divine providence, we'd love to read it on the show. Just email thegoodnessofgodpod at gmail.com. goodnessofgodpod@gmail.com. I have gotten into our email server now, so soon there will be podcast@servantsnow.org. That can happen. But in the meantime, you can email us there. This show is a product of the Servants Now Media Lab at Servants of Christ United Methodist Parish, deep in the heart of Southeast Houston. It was made possible by an Innovators Grant by the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. If you would like to find out more about what we are doing here at Servants of Christ or what happens here in the Media Lab, just go to our website, servantsnow.org, go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/servantsnow, or go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/servantsnow. And in the meantime, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we'll see you next week.